Good evening. It's June 6th, 2024, to another one of our Branches on the Vine with the Bible Project and the Sermon on the Mount series. So the Bible Project, they created this series to cover an entire year, right? Every 5 weeks, they're going to release another episode. And we're going to take some time to discuss each of these major videos and, of course, some other creative topics that they present along the way. The videos that we're going to be discussing, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend. They can all be found in the Bible Project app. Link, of course, to that is in the description. So, welcome this evening to episode 5 of Sermon on the Mount. Don't make oaths. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemies. But why? This is part 3 of 3 on the Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, so you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, I think these might be useful to others. That's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So this sermon, again, it's found in Matthew 5 through 7. And for me, it's the seminal moments in the teachings of Jesus. Because this really is his longest, deepest, widest teaching that we have recorded in all of Scripture. And it covers things that we love to talk about, yet deep down, we really have challenges living. So, Sermon on the Mount, Episode 5, Don't Make Oaths, Turn the Other Cheek, Love Your Enemies. But why? And this is part 3 of 3. So, let's refresh our memories with the video, and we'll see where it takes us. Enjoy.
Conflict in relationships is unavoidable. Even with your friends and family, maintaining peace is a struggle.
And it's even more difficult with our enemies, people who are out to get us.
Right. This is true of any time and any place in human history. Where there are people, there is strife and violence.
And this was definitely true in the time of Jesus, when Roman forces occupied the lands of Israel. So in his teachings, Jesus gives a radical vision for how his followers can seek peace in the midst of this conflict and work to repair even the most difficult relationships.
Jesus is an Israelite, and he believes that God's wisdom for relationships is found in the covenant laws given to ancient Israel.
And so in these teachings, Jesus will quote from one of those laws and then show the wisdom that's underneath.
So Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to the ancients, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.'"
Now, in Israel, an oath was a type of promise where you swear by God that you will do what you say.
Like if you want to borrow some money, you could swear by God to repay me.
Exactly. And you can trust me because in Israel's covenant laws, God requires me to keep my oaths.
So oaths are a great way to avoid disputes.
You would think so, but even oaths can be twisted to take advantage of people. For example, what if I swear by God's temple that I will repay you?
Well, I know the law requires you to honor your oath, so it's a deal.
But I didn't exactly swear by God, just by his temple. So I'm not really bound to the oath.
So you're tricking me into trusting you.
Exactly. So Jesus cuts through all of this and says, just don't make oaths at all, by God or by anything else in God's world.
Never make a promise to anyone?
Well, not quite. His point is that when you do make a promise, don't use God's reputation as a tool to manipulate people.
Right, Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no.
Being a peacemaker starts with a radical commitment to honesty and integrity.
Now, I can see how this works if I started the conflict, but what if someone else starts a conflict with me?
Well, the next case study actually gets into exactly that.
Jesus quotes from the Torah, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth."
This is a famous line known as the law of retaliation.
Yeah, you harm me, I can harm you back. This kind of sounds like a license for revenge that can get out of hand.
Well, actually, this law was designed to limit the amount of retribution you can demand. It should be equal to the amount of harm done and not more.
Oh, so this law keeps peace by restraining our urge to hurt back those who hurt us.
Yes, and Jesus takes the wisdom of this law to a new level, telling his followers, don't even pay back an evil person.
Don't retaliate at all?
Yes, become people who value peace more than getting even.
But letting people get away with evil won't bring peace. You just can't stand by and do nothing.
Hold on, Jesus doesn't say do nothing. Rather, he advocates a really bold and creative response to evil that is nonviolent, so it can open the door for peace.
What does that look like?
Well, Jesus gives 3 examples from his own time and place.
First, he says, whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to them as well.
In the ancient Roman world, a right cheek slap with the back of the right hand was a symbolic way of dominating someone.
And humiliating them.
But Jesus says, don't retaliate. Rather, stand your ground and offer them the left cheek. This will force your attacker to strike with an open right hand. In other words, to strike you like an equal.
And it forces them to treat you as a fellow human being.
Yes, even if it costs you.
Well, next, Jesus says, if anyone sues you and takes your shirt, let him have your coat also.
Yeah, in ancient Israel, taking a poor person's coat was against the law because it's also their blanket to keep warm at night.
But a really uncaring person could find a way around this by demanding their shirt as payment.
Right. So Jesus offers a creative response. Give them your shirt and also give them your coat.
Why would you do that? Wouldn't that leave you exposed?
Exactly. Jesus is being provocative. The goal is to shock everyone around by exposing this injustice through costly generosity.
The third example is whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2.
In Jesus' day, a Roman soldier could force any subject to carry their packs for them up to 1 mile.
How humiliating and dangerous.
And so Jesus says, carry that load not just 1 mile, but 2. The first mile, he might treat you like a pack animal, but by going that 2nd mile, you assert your humanity as you choose to treat him like a friend.
Wait, treat an enemy oppressor like a friend?
Yeah, it sounds crazy. But Jesus is saying that bold generosity can subvert the power games of our world and even turn enemies into friends. And that leads to the last law that Jesus quotes.
You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.
Jesus is quoting an ancient biblical law when he says, love your neighbor. But then he quotes a popular line that many Israelites added to the law, but you can hate your enemy. Jesus counters this by telling his followers, love your enemies and pray for those who mistreat you.
Now, isn't this going a bit far? Peace with my enemies is one thing, but loving them?
Yes, Jesus seems to think that true peace is only possible when we treat every human as if they have ultimate value, which means that even my enemy is a fellow image of God.
But how am I supposed to love someone who hates me? It's hard enough to love the people that love me.
And our love for our friends and our family is a good thing. But for Jesus, that is just the starting point. He challenges his followers to share that same love outside our circles of comfort. And he holds up God's indiscriminate, generous love as the model.
Jesus says, God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous.
The call is to become peacemakers who are inviting others in, working to mend broken relationships at every level in our communities.
It really is a radical way to live.
Yes. Jesus calls it becoming complete when he says, be complete just as your heavenly Father is complete. It means imitating God's generosity to both friends and enemies, because for Jesus, creative love is the only pathway to real peace.
We just finished the teachings of Jesus on how to do right by others in our most difficult relationships.
Next, Jesus will explore the problem of religious hypocrisy and how it can ruin even our best attempts to honor God.
So, what'd you think? Yeah? So we left off last week with cost, right? That following God, following Jesus, it costs. It costs our lives, it would seem. But again, Jesus reminds us that yes, it can cost you, and some more than others. But just keep your eye on me, right? My example should be the one you should live by, because I have the balanced scales in the end. I love the next example that they talk about with the coat and shirt analogy, right? Because Tim does a wonderful job. We like to draw it in, right? How does the picture look like at that time, right? In that space, in that place. And this particular one is good. This is where a point where you don't take a poor man's cloak because it was considered his blanket as well. Yeah. So stretch this, but think of it as a shelter, a means of protection. So they wiggle around and they just take the shirt because it's underneath the cloak. It's not really taking their protection, their shelter away. And Jesus again gives us a daunting and somewhat shocking visual. Give it all, shirt and cloak. Truth be told, in this picture, one could probably not be more vulnerable, right? You've let them see all of your humanity. Jesus is talking to us because we're the people losing our shirts. We're losing our coats. It is us. And Jesus didn't say, that's not right. Jesus said, it's the way it looks in my kingdom. This is what happens. It might happen to you. And when it does, of course, again, the example works well. But since it's not really a short jacket thing for us, we just find ways around it. We talk around it. We work around it. We find excuses for it. We find ways not to do this because fill in the blank. Because it's an uncomfortable answer. It's an uncomfortable discussion. Because we don't like it. And of course, the third example, it forces you to go 1 mile. Again, go the extra mile. We're not forced to carry conquering forces baggage around, at least not in America. Doesn't really fit today, does it? So maybe this really doesn't apply to us. But then sometimes, I think when we get into where we're needed, able to maybe help somebody or do something, it's taking more time. Maybe that's how to look at it. It's taking more time and we go, I have somewhere else to be. I have something else to do. I got to do, whatever, fill in the blank. We don't have the extra time. In time for us, that's a commodity, right? Back then, in this example, it's more visceral. It's more physical. It's carrying something for somebody. But again, what might a follower of Jesus look like? Be an example of this is what God followers looked like. So yes, ouch. This is ugly. This is uncomfortable. Because this is stuff. We don't want to talk about staying longer. We don't want to talk about helping longer. We don't want to talk about doing more. And again, I loved a phrase that Tim used with carrying the pack the extra mile. I really love this when he said, you were asserting your humanity when you carry the extra mile, when you do more. Yeah, I love that for a couple of reasons. I think one of the strongest is, because maybe God caused it, and now he wants to see what we do, and he wants us to want to do it. Maybe because I think that's really what being an image of God is. Yes, really is being human. That is showing our humanity. And I think being human is in how do we treat others? How do we treat them as human beings? As God-created beings? Because they're not treating them like human beings. They're treating them like pack mules. So our response because I'm a human being, I'll assert the point. Because I'm a human being, I will respond as a human being. I will choose to go the extra mile. Yeah, Tim puts it, sounds crazy. It does. It does. Especially in our world today. Because it doesn't work in a Greek world. Doesn't work in a logic world. I agree. I can't contest that. But I'm more and more compelled that I don't think God isn't a Greek thinker or based on logic. I think that's part of the point here. And in our humanity and how he wants us to be different, he wants us to act like we should. And I think like this expectation, it goes back, way back. And I think that's why the story starts, not in Matthew, starts out in Genesis. You know, we just wrapped up a study in the Outside the Class series in this Eat This Book. And at the end, we were with Nehemiah. Yeah? Because this was part of Israel's redemption, right? We were talking about how God is redeeming them and how he wants them to act in the land. So they start with listening to Torah from beginning to end. Nehemiah and Ezra are on a platform at the Watergate in a ruined, rubble Jerusalem, you know, probably with the temple in view, that destroyed temple. And they read Torah. And they weep because they needed to get back to Torah. I think this is where Jesus is taking us. Jesus is taking us on some uncomfortable stuff because we're going back to Torah. Because the problem was, he got away from it. That's what got you here. That's why we're here in this messed up space. We're in the spot because we got away from Torah. You know, Jesus is telling them the same thing. Got to get back to Torah. And his example and his teachings, they lead the way. They're the path back. The next point they brought up, I think, brings up some interesting things because in this phrase that we've heard, you've heard it said, right? We've heard this more than once already. And has referred to what the scribes have been telling them about Torah when they're reading it about it. Right? But in this point, the heard it said, right, has a bit of an appendage attached. Something had crept into the script. Love your neighbor, hate your enemy. So oddly enough, that hate your enemy had crept in. I think that was just to justify our actions. It's interesting, even with this. Jesus desired not to dwell on the inconsistency. He just blew the whole thing out of the water. You know, we thought the last two were hard, thought they were challenging, didn't want to do, right? Oaths or letting go of retaliation. But now, love your enemies? I love the point when Jesus says, love your enemy and pray for those that mistreat you. You know, there's a part of our lives we spend in prayer, and we eventually get to the prayer that Jesus brings up. I suspect when we get there, there's going to be a lot to unpack. But in our prayer time, at least on the churchy side, we usually spend time on our list of wants and needs, right? Praying for ourselves, praying for our family, praying for our friends. I'm not saying those are wrong, but I suspect, again, when we get to the Jesus prayer, we're going to be challenged a bit more. But in that list that we have, our enemies probably didn't make the prayer list. Yet, Jesus says, pray for them. Now, here's one of those thoughts, or those interesting little thoughts that creep in. So, what's that mean? Pray for your enemies. So, are we saying something like, I'll pray for you, God, please rain down hellfire on my enemy. They deserve it. Maybe let them see your right hand, just hand, the gauntlet thing. Or are we saying, please help my enemies see the light as I want to tell them and show them? Or are we saying, God, meet them where they are, help them where they need help, and then maybe, even more scarily bold, we ask God, how can I be part of this? How are we part of love for my enemy? That's probably a point worth looking at someday, because it's personal. Loving my enemy. Because this is a thought-stretching calling. Jesus is stretching just peacemaker with your enemy. This is more than you can just exist on your side of the line, your chasm. I'll exist on my side. It's not just living peacefully with your enemy. It's loving your enemy. Then, when we talk about love, that's where this really gets complicated. Because when we talk about love, we have all these things we talk about with our families, friends, maybe food we eat, things we like to do. And they all often allude to a very positive experience, right? A very nurturing experience, a very enjoyable experience. But when we talk about loving your enemy, maybe it's a clenched teeth thought. Maybe that's just with a tight jaw and, I'll just love them because I have to love them. And maybe, Jesus, especially with love as a part, Jesus wants us to want to love them. I think maybe that's what Jesus is looking for. Again, he's calling us to a greater thing because it's going to look different. Radical. Loving the unlovable. Oh, wait. That sounds an awful lot more like God's love. Because that's how we want God to love and treat us. Remember, Jesus takes us back to the murder-hate scenario. We're looking back again at that word hate. And when that devalues a human being, when that discredits their humanity. And this has stepped that up. Jesus is saying everyone has that value. Everyone has equal value as a created being of God. Because I think at times we think that the churchy people have more value, right? Because they're followers of God. Those that follow God, of course, they're more valuable. And God, it seems to see everyone with equal value. Which then again brings up a whole different set of questions, ones we probably don't have time to dive into today. I think just suffice to say that looking at somebody through God's eyes is very challenging. It's almost daunting. Again, we thought Torah was hard. I like how Tim put it, that we need to love people outside of our circles of comfort. It's a very good statement. It's an interesting and challenging thought to process that we need to step up to, how we view different people. Trust me, it's not easy. It's something we don't like to do. It's not fun. This is hard. It takes work to look at everyone as a created image of God. Yeah, called to be peacemakers, to mend relationships, not break them. Mend them. Matthew 5:9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. It's a daunting task. It's an important task. How do we do it? I really did love how Tim put it. Creative love is the only pathway to real peace. That's scary. That's terrifying. Again, like I've said before, living out our salvation with fear and trembling. Because yes, Jesus is calling us to a radical change. To be complete. To live complete. This is what complete looks like. Again, I love the way Tim put it. Creative love is the only pathway to real peace. So we've just wrapped up this part, right? This is the second 3 in the 6 case studies that we see how we want to live this out with Jesus' guidelines, with Jesus' reminders, with Jesus' example of how we might choose to live. And maybe we're finding it does look a lot like Torah. Remember, description below. It's a link to the Folks of the Bible Project and a link to the app so you can follow along and see each one as they premiere. And of course, all those additional topics that they discuss. Because we're going to continue to be on this journey, right? This exciting and thought-provoking journey. This Sermon on the Mount. Because we're going to see what wonderful things we're going to continue to uncover. So, thanks for with us tonight with the Sermon on the Mount. Our third part of 3 on another edition of The Dusty Feet.